So now a few words to introduce Nina Maritz. After Carin Smuts or Francis Carey, for instance, African architecture with Nina Maritz confirms that, well, she comes from Namibie and confirms that it is a scene where the scarcity of resources stimulates inventivity. She studied in South Africa in the Cape, and then she settled in Namibia, which has a more rural society and a semi-arid climate. But to introduce her, I'm going to, since I'm lazy today, I'm going to quote somebody else. I'm going to quote the depiction given by Carin Smuts, with whom Nina studied. She is, Carin Smuts is well known here. She has become French, and all architectural schools want to work with her and send her students. She introduced the concept of empowerment, which is very difficult to translate into French. We no longer translate it, actually. The word has become French, and it is due to Carin Smuts. Well, this is Nina, presented by Carin. Her projects respond to their context in a very sensitive but powerful way. They look like they were born from the landscape, and this is due to Nina's ability to evaluate this landscape, to erect buildings that will work with those characteristics, the landscape's features, a slope, the orientation, a waterway, shrubs, existing buildings, pathways, and so on. So her work is place-specific, sensitive to the balance between materials, details, and space creation. She involves users in the process, which leads to appropriate solutions. Appropriate combines several factors: low energy materials, manufacturing on the spot to develop local economy, and involvement of communities and their skills. Nina's projects are respectful of the landscape, but also society, culture, and budget. They are functional because Nina considers that when resources are scarce, squandering them for no effect is a crime. So a new version of ornament is a crime. Her deep interest for natural indigenous resources, for trees and shrubs, which to her are parts of a place, these are an integral part of designing. What I admire in her architecture, says Carin Smuts, is that it is always the result of a collective effort and contributes to a very fair development model. Thank you, Nina.
I do apologize for sitting down, but as you can see, I've joined Neil Armstrong in the footwear department, so it's easier for me to sit. I'd like to thank the Global Awards of Sustainable Architecture, and in particular Jana Revedin and Marie-Hélène Contal, for inviting me to join this prestigious forum and this formidable network. I must say I find the other three a bit of a hard act to follow. I'm very impressed with everything that they've done. And it's really amazing to me to see that there's a kind of a shared thinking in the world which is not subscribing to the kind of hegemony of corporate architecture which is being preached nowadays. I'll be using the term me and I interchangeably, as Nina Maritz Architects consists of quite a few different people. We're usually about 5 to 6 people in the office, and it changes over the years with interns and so on, but we're definitely a community, not a group. Africa is often seen as a single entity, but it is a continent, not a country, and Namibia within Africa sets a context for our work. It's quite particular. Namibia has very diverse ethnicities. You can see all the different languages that we have, and also from different areas. And here you can see some of the different tribes that we have. We often work with all the different types of people. And the last project that I will be showing you is the one where we're working with the Jujuan San people in the bottom left. During German colonial rule from the mid-1800s, Namibia suffered a little-known genocide when about 80% of the Herero people, about 50% of the Nama, and an unknown number of San people were exterminated. And then from 1915 to 1990, South Africa ruled, first under a mandate from not the United Nations, the predecessor, but they entrenched apartheid from 1948 onwards. So the same kind of rules that applied in South Africa applied here. And then from 1966, there was quite a brutal border war between SWAPO, the liberation movement, and the South African army. So Namibia still suffers from almost 100 years of foreign occupation and still has a high inequality rating, even though it has improved from, the Gini coefficient has improved from 0.64 at independence to 0.57. To give you a bit of perspective, France is currently at 0.33. China is at about 0.7, and the Swedish, Scandinavian countries are at about 0.2. Sorry, I'm losing some of my slides. I think I'm pressing the wrong button. Okay. We've got a very low population, and our mainly desert ecology means that we only have four industries or four economic pillars. We've got mining, fisheries, farming, and tourism. The rest is negligible. We've got almost no manufacturing. And subsistence farming and commercial agriculture, mainly freehold meat farming, supports 70% of the population. But what's happening with the impact of climate change is that the situation is changing radically, and they estimate by 2030 is that most people won't be able to subsist anymore from agriculture. And for 70% of the population, that is quite a dramatic problem. A third of Namibians are already bordering on starvation, and that is not a mismanagement issue. It's purely a climate change result. We've been having increasing droughts every year, and you can imagine with a marginal environment, it is a problem. But everything isn't bad news. Namibia has been lauded worldwide for its conservancy model, where the local community becomes responsible for and benefits from the sustainable management of natural resources. This helps the community to compensate for failing subsistence farming, and by providing meat from sustainably harvested game and generating income from tourism and trophy hunting. Yes, albeit controversial. So our work relates strongly to the environment and to survival for people and the wilderness. We focus on ecological sustainability, and we work mostly for those who need it in a context driven by frugality. Being an architect is a bit of a strange existence, isn't it? You start working or thinking as an architect 24/7 from the day that you start studying, and you often end up only interacting with other architects. So we tend to build a kind of mystique around ourselves. We form a closed group, and we start believing in a lot of architectural perceptions. But because both my parents were architects, I grew up in quite a sort of critical household, and I was inoculated against that. And I'd like to explain a bit about where I come from and my beginnings, because when I have to prepare a talk, I always try and think about life, the universe, and everything to try and think about what am I doing here on this earth in this time. There's a Nigerian proverb which says that to know where you're going to, you have to know where you're coming from. And how I grew up and where I live now has naturally had a great influence on my work. My family was always busy making things. It was a very practical, tactile childhood. We did sand castles on the beach rather than television. We played with clay, as my mom was a potter. My father did woodwork. We helped him in the garden. We worked with textiles, all sorts of things. And my brother became a painter. And so these things became very important to what we were about. It's about context and crafting, about being and making, the identity of a place and making things in a very practical way. Yes, I did grow up under apartheid. We lived in South Africa, in Port Elizabeth, and Namibie was also seen as a part of South Africa at the time. But my early childhood was very comfortable and happy, as white people were cocooned away from the problems of apartheid. Strict censorship and movement control kept us largely isolated from what was happening. And then during high school, I became aware that there was something really wrong. I went to a government school, so we were never enlightened about things. But, you know, you start questioning this kind of weird lifestyle of living separately and black people being so poor and white people being so wealthy in comparison. So I went to the University of Cape Town, which at the time was seen as a hotbed of resistance. And there we were exposed to a lot more in terms of what we were doing as architects and our social and environmental role as architects. So this background will always have a great influence on me. It really affects, I think my thinking was formed through that. Okay, I think we've had enough context now, some buildings. This is our office. It was converted from an old art building next to my house. And what we did is we made a kind of a remix. We reused we put another floor on, and then we reused a lot of the material on the things that we've done. So it's like an environment has to be biodiverse in order to survive. I think that they're more ecologically sound than monocultures. I think that a functionally flexible and an evolving space is much healthier for people and for the planet. I once worked in an office which had no windows and the walls were painted black. And you go in the morning and the day would go by and you'd come out in the evening and it would feel as if you're in a kind of underground tank all the time. So a view outside is absolutely essential. This is our main drawing studio. We used old burglar bars that we found on the site, and we made the steps from leftover grids from a building site. We've got solar power. We used old sample tiles for wall tiling, and we use recycled water, which the entire city uses. So it's not the conventional architect's office, but it's a place that where we like to embrace diversity in an ecological sense as well as in a human sense. So you can see the kind of interventions were very much within the existing structure. A lot of our buildings are made by people who are very unskilled. It results in a design and a technology that results in an aesthetic that doesn't photograph well. You know, it's a bit of a handicap in the contemporary architectural market if you struggle to take good photographs of your buildings. And I've always felt a bit of an outsider as an architect, not a kind of architect's architect. I read in the science fiction as a teenager that there were lots of narratives that focused on a struggle between good and evil, the haves and the have-nots. And it conjured images of powerful cities inside high walls with outside the wild, and the wild sheltered impoverished renegades, which were usually the heroes of the stories. And as a child, I thought that this was fantasy. I didn't think it would become reality. That surrounded by these physical and virtual walls of wealth, privileged lives would be lubricated by money and technology. And on the periphery, others would eke out a meager existence, trying to survive. Like this community of crystal sellers for whom we designed a market based on the concept of a geode. That was how they every day they packed out their things in this isolated stretch next to a T-junction in the desert. And every evening they had to pack everything in again and take it to their houses a kilometer or two away. So we designed a structure which is a shelter, which is very rugged on the outside, and on the inside it's filled with beauty. We have these 3 gabion-filled walls that create sales areas, and on the inside we have these timber structures with tray tables. The tables have a removable lid, so you can you only put your display in once and then you lock it up at night. And the structures were made from the local stone. There's no cement in the construction. Timber poles, corrugated iron roof sheeting, everything can be removed and can be reused. So the idea was that it allows for an infinite variety of possibilities in the future. In the background of this dichotomy of rich and poor that we have, we still have nature in Namibia. We have a lot of the wild. And the wild here shelters the complex interactions that sustain life. So we also have a lot of work that we do in quite fragile natural environments, and a lot of it has to do with tourism. So, for instance, here at the edge of the Fish River Canyon, it's the second largest canyon after the Grand Canyon. People tend to look at deserts and they think that there's nothing there. It's a tabula rasa. But what we try and do is try and brainwash people into realizing that there is complexity and that it's worthy of respect. So when you arrive at go to the viewpoint, you come along this long flat plain and you don't see anything of the canyon. You don't even realize that it's there. So we built a very low platform which hides this kind of in the skyline. We've got ablutions underneath, and then it hugs this horizontal line. Only when you get to the top do you look over, and then you see this beautiful canyon below. We've made, everything is very robust. We've got baboons on the site, and baboons break everything. It's very windy as well. You can imagine the uplift that comes from the canyon. So we anchored everything in the ground. We clad everything with metal. And, you know, you can have the heaviest wind and the most rambunctious baboons, and they can't break anything. Even at the toilets, we didn't think how we could get them to not go into the toilets, because they can open almost any kind of latch or lock. But then we decided we'll put on a padlock with a number and a sign with a number on it, the code, because whatever they can do, the baboons won't learn to read. When we try and conserve nature, we must also think that there's nature-related culture. It's not, humans and nature aren't separated. So we've worked on one project on the remnants of the very earliest hunter-gatherer societies at the Twyfelfontein World Heritage Site. The archaeologists most familiar with this particular site think that the engravings were made during the state of trance, and also to symbolize trance. I want you to close your eyes quickly and then just press your fingertips lightly on your eyes. You'll probably see the after effects of the image, but you'll also see little dots of light. And those little dots of light are called phosphenes, or entoptics. And when you go into the first stage of trance, these become very emphasized and you're very aware of them. So at the center, what we did is we created a kind of a trance room. So you go into the space which is dark, and then you just see these light patterns, to try and explain to the people that they get a feeling of what the engravings are for. The site is very fragile. It has a lot of sandstone, and the visitors can be very destructive. They throw Coca-Cola on the engravings to make them more visible, and they walk all over them. So part of our job was to try and inculcate a sense of appreciation. In the second stage of trance, in the second stage of trance, you start visualizing an association with these patterns that you see. So, for instance, if you see certain kind of lines, if you're a sand person, a bushman, you might imagine this to be an eland. And as you go further into the trance experience, in the third stage, in full trance, you become this eland. And in full trance, if you're a shaman, You can move around in the spirit world, you can cause rain to fall, you can heal the sick, and you can also enchant the eland to be hunted the next day. About 25% of all human beings have the ability to go into trance. It's not such a unique phenomenon. And the Bushmen in particular use it very strongly as part of their cultural heritage. So the concept of trance and then also the surrounding landscape inspired in us a free-form design with Gabion Walls roofed by curved steel structures, which were made in roof tiles that we cut from old oil drums. You know, these 55-gallon drums that people store oil in. So we cut them and then we interlocked them like Roman roof tiles. And the structure blends in the landscape very well. The sandstone has iron oxide in it, and the rust is iron oxide on the building, so it's almost completely invisible. And the building is fully reversible. It means we can take up everything, every single thing in it, and it can be reused, and it will not leave anything. I felt that it was important because even though this site has been explored and excavated, well, we think fully, we never know what's going to happen in 50 years' time. Maybe by then they realize that we've built on top of an unexplored site, and we have to move the building. I think it's important that architects don't become too precious about their buildings, and designing a building which is reversible is kind of the ultimate of that. The Gabion Walls are quite interesting because they act like a rock store. The building's not sealed, it's got open windows and things, and the temperatures outside can become really hot. But because of the rock store effect, the building is several degrees cooler than the outside, even on the hottest day. The oil drums didn't just give us roof sheeting, but we used the ends for screens, some solid and some not solid. And then the shadow patterns that the screens create also enhance that effect of trance, the feeling of the kind of disorientation that you need in order to get trance. I found this quite an interesting point of view when I read it. Yum, yum. It implies that architecture that embeds itself in a social context is usually distasteful, because aesthetics is seen as the main purpose of contemporary architectural design. And such a viewpoint has the result that we have a lot of abstract object buildings. We have illusions of perfection, these metaphorically, sometimes literally, pure, pristine white cubes. But there's a different approach that doesn't pursue a beautiful object as its goal, but rather a process, a kind of aim towards an equilibrium which is constantly in movement within the overall search of sustainability. In this process, beauty then becomes a tool rather than an end goal. So we use aesthetics, we use aesthetics to inspire people and people to inspire aesthetics. This kind of process has a very strong textural quality for me. It has a virility in its roughness. It's outwardly orientated. It's a locus for activity which extends beyond the inside. And it can also transform the architecture over time. It can be messy, but it's never static. At the Habitat Center, which was our kind of breakthrough project, our first big project as a practice, we experimented with a lot of things, materials, technologies, design strategies, and forms, because I felt that the building itself, it's a research center, and therefore the process of the building itself should be research. So we used solar panels for shading, and we used concrete test cubes for paving and for Gabion Walls. We used salvaged stone from excavations for paving, and so on. We taught the welder how to design things with scrap metal. We did it in phases. So in the first phase, we had a sculptor who assisted him, and then the second phase, we said to him, now you're on your own, you know enough, and he came up with some really beautiful designs. We used gravel from the excavation as ground covering, and we used polystyrene packaging from fridges and things like that for insulation. Sandbag and concrete walls, green roofs, biogas digester, and there are lots of ideas. I'm not going to go through them this evening, it's too many. But the point that I want to make is that the project is a collage. It's a kind of antithesis of the very pristine object building. Here you can see that the process became the product and vice versa. It's a kind of a dialectical conversation. Then after the Habitat Centre, we started doing a lot more community projects because in a way, people started getting more confidence in these alternative ways of building, because we could say to them, yes, we know how sandbags work, we did it at the Habitat Centre, we can show you that kind of thing. And this is an interesting project. It's in the north central area, Ohanya Community Crafts, and there is no stone for hundreds of kilometers. So we used sandbags. But what's also interesting is this is the area of the border wall. And during the war, the South African Defence Force built these bomb shelters out of sandbags, which they just abandoned after they left. Then after they left, people, especially children would play in these shelters, and sometimes they would collapse with fatal results. So there was a kind of a natural distrust of the idea of sandbags. So what we did is we made a steel structure. We've got a steel load-bearing structure, and the sandbags merely form walls. I didn't want to force people into trying to adopt a technology which they've already had bad experience with by making domes and so on, even though it is most likely that it would work. Here you can see some of the construction during the process. The building houses a showroom and offices and a shipping depot for several dozen crafters in the region. They bring their things there and then it gets shipped for wholesale sales. In case you wondered, we do get paid for these projects. We don't do them entirely for free, but we've got a kind of system of cross-subsidization in the office where our government projects and our private client projects help cross-subsidize our NGO projects, so we balance things. We've actually got a fixed tariff of fees in Namibia for architects, but we try and sort of juggle things to make it work. And this project was quite fun. It was mainly designed by a young architect in my office with my input, and we built it in several increments. So there were some old conservancy offices, and then we added this. It's mainly a wall. It's a tourist information center node, and it's a kind of a wall where behind it is a community gathering space. But the wall is also something that can grow. We built as much as money would allow, and you can see those little rectangles are foundations that just come up to like ankle height. So when we ever get money again, we can build them up into little shops. So we didn't give back the last few $1,000s. We just put them into foundations. And the wall kind of merges with the landscape, but inside it's got a ramp that goes up to a little platform. It's a very flat landscape, and then from the platform, you can see the Brandberg, which is the biggest mountain in Namibia, and it's got quite a mythological significance in the area. And then to go to the ramp, the visitors have to go past our information display. And the information display, we created the kind of story of the lives of the people in the area. But what we did is we had a workshop with the children of the local school where they did drawings, and then we reworked this into the kind of overall information panel. We were 4 adults from my office having the workshop with all these little kids. We brought the pencils and the paper and the crayons and cool drinks and things. And the children had a fantastic time. They loved it, but by the end of the day, you had to carry the 4 of us out there, the 4 adults, because we were so tired. we try to simplify our work all the time. You know, when you work with very few materials and so on, it's a problem. But if you take all the different factors that architecture needs, all the influences on the built environment, you end up with complexity. It's inevitable. It's a bit like evolution. This was quite a recent project. It was probably the biggest project that we did, and it consisted of 3 different regional libraries on 3 very different sites, but they had a common brief. So we decided to use a kind of a modular system, functional modules, and then we assembled them in different ways on each of the sites. Because Namibia has excellent solar exposure, it's probably, apart from the Saharan countries, it's probably the best in the world. So what we did is the form was generated from having roofs that were solar ready. They all face north, they're all at the optimum pitch. And because of the steep pitch, it's about 23 degrees in Namibia, we could slip in a mezzanine floor for about 2/3 of the space. These libraries are also built in areas where people are mostly exposed to single-story construction. You know, they've never dealt with double-story construction. So we felt it was a nice opportunity to create some spatial volume and so on, that people would be a bit more opened out to this idea that space can flow and that it's not just 4 walls and a roof. Passive design, like Marta uses, getting the sun in, low in the winter, elongated east-west facades with shortened end facades, shaded, low maintenance, durable clay brick walls, large thermal mass with which we temper the kind of extremes. And we have a lot of glazing for ample daylighting. So the building operates completely by daylighting in the day, and the solar panels provide 90% of the power for the building. We alleviate the heat with lots of methods. We've got large overhangs, we've got shaded pergolas, we've got screens, because the issue is, of course, the sun on the glass. The photograph at the top left that you see there, it really is that bright and light. The photograph is not washed out or overexposed. Sometimes when I go to a site like this and I wear my dark sunglasses, sort of by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I think, but why didn't I put on my sunglasses? And then they're on my face all the time, but the brightness just comes through. Yes, we have high ceilings, stack effect, we've got cross ventilation, evaporative cooling, we've got concrete floors for radiant cooling, cross ventilation, all these things. And then in winter, we have these large ramps to the side, and they act as a kind of a sun trap, because we didn't want direct sun in the library area itself, but so the heat gathers in this ramp area and then flows into the interior. We use the main walls, the outside walls of the buildings, as the perimeter. In Namibia, they love enclosing things with palisade fences. It's very hostile. But we brought the building to the outside, so these become public squares. And what's very nice is that because the libraries have free Wi-Fi, you often see in the evening people sitting on the steps and chatting. It's become a real social space because they have access to this free Wi-Fi. Data is incredibly expensive in Namibia. We have the most expensive data in the world. It's probably about 10 or 15 times what you pay in Europe. These modules cluster around internal courtyards. We've got a children's courtyard. We've got another kind of movie theatre courtyard, amphitheatre courtyard, so that you can have different outdoor activities. We also decided not to use imported state-of-the-art library shelving. You know, you get these absolutely fantastic things with all the bells and whistles in catalogues that you can get from America and Germany and so on. But we felt it was important that the money should be spent in the country, and also we have an invasive timber called prosopis. So we didn't want to use Meranti, which is the ubiquitous hardwood that people use, that they get from Borneo and Malaysia. And we didn't want to use the indigenous hardwood, which is a kind of teak, which is also endangered. So this prosopis timber, which is invasive, it's quite difficult to work. We used about 50 cubic meters for each library to make all the shelving and all the furniture from it. And it is an absolutely fantastic material once you get the carpenters and the joiners to actually agree to work it. It really softens up the space. I've never worked with timber a lot before because I don't want to use unsustainable timber. And we don't, apart from this, we don't have sustainable timber. But it was really fantastic, and now I try and use it everywhere. It's also created a bit of an industry in Namibia for the prosopis now, which is something that you can do in a small country. This is the children's library, which was very bright and multicolored. And then we also had signage was kind of iconic and multilingual. Iconic because a lot of the older people in the rural areas are illiterate. And we wanted to make them feel also as welcome in the library because there are all sorts of media that you can use without being literate. And each centre had a theme for the region. So in the Maheke region, where cattle and red sand is ubiquitous, we use these orange colours and cattle patterns. In Oshana, the word Oshana means a shallow pond. We used blue for water and water patterns. And in Ohangwena, which is a very forested area, we used this green patterning. And it was only once, we ran into trouble with the materials, I must say, because we had lots of 3D renderings to present at the early participation workshops and so on. And people loved it. They thought they were beautiful. But as you can see, it doesn't really give you the true feeling of raw concrete and red brick. And at the most chaotic stage of the construction, this stage, the clients just said, the user clients from the Ministry of Education just said, sorry, we don't want red brick and concrete. And at first we resisted it. We thought they were just being, petit bourgeois. But then we realized that they associate the red brick and the concrete with these very brutalist style buildings that were built in the apartheid era for control purposes. And so we compromised, we backtracked, we ended up tiling a lot of the concrete columns. We painted walls, we painted concrete, and we had mesh balustrades, and we changed them to purpose-made steel balustrades and so on. And once the space was together and everything was finished, they loved it. But I'm very glad that we made those compromises. You know, we all get stuck in this thing of like, we know, the architect knows best, and it's absolutely nonsense. It's something that I keep on having to tell myself every time I do a project. But this highlights a challenge for us. You know, our communities aren't isolated, naive rural people. They aren't unsophisticated. And they derive their aspirations, like all upcoming middle classes, from American-style television and the contemporary consumerist society. They want to see they want to have what they see on television. And what happens is that there's a kind of disconnect between what people as individuals and the country can afford and what people want to have. And people don't get their notions from trendy minimalist architecture in magazines or from romantic perceptions of rustic design. The hills of the planet ends up being a distant reality if you on the lower income side of things. And we need to reconcile these aspirations with sustainable design, which is very difficult. You can't tell people to do it. You have to kind of involve people in the process in such a way that they decide to do it. Many people do dream of a future where everybody will be middle income, but I don't think that's the reality. Poverty is increasing exponentially, and we need to ensure that there's decent survival for the poor without destroying the planet. People that we can learn a lot from in terms of materialism and non-materialism are the San. They have the oldest and most complex DNA in the world, and also the similar with their languages. They're being studied by anthropologists and linguists and geneticists. I think each individual San person has met more anthropologists than are in Paris together. Their culture is inherently egalitarian and non-materialist, and in their original hunter-gatherer lifestyle, there was no specialization. Unfortunately, they're very marginalized. They're struggling to adapt to the modern world. They struggle to get through the school. And so our Naina Village project aims at building 5 small 2-classroom schools from grade 1 to 3 near their home villages, so that they can be close to friends and families and still keep their traditional culture. We used again the concept of modules, and the shapes are wedge-shaped so that we can get away from orthogonal layouts to something that's more close to their worldview. And we can double it and use it differently on different sites. The design is ultra basic. If it has to be 4 walls, a roof, and a floor, maybe not even a floor, it can be that. The budget is about €200,000 per school. We'll build the steel frame with a more skilled builder first, and then we'll work with the communities to build infill walling with whatever material is available on site. Some it's stone, some it's sand, some it's clay. And in this kind of project, the architect does a lot more than just design and draw. We workshop, we do fundraising, we do construction training, etc. I hope you've noticed the donation website address. I think architects have been involved with the image for far too long. You know, we're all participants in this kind of a commodification of architecture. Our modern lifestyles are not sustainable, no matter how much technology we throw at it to save energy and whatnot. We humans are responsible for the ecological crisis, and we humans living in the developed world are the most guilty. We don't do these community projects to get some fuzzy, warm feeling. These people deserve our respect. They live far more sustainable lives than us. In their context, frugal architecture is really possible, and it forces you to confront limited resources to solve very, very real problems, not luxury grievances, not whether your taps are designed by Philippe Starck or by somebody else. And in order to help safeguard the natural habitat for these very processes that we need to sustain life, we need to be more frugal. I've been having doubts about our approach over the last few years, and it's maybe these consumerist conflicts or getting older, but I became increasingly pessimistic about being complicit in the Earth's destruction. And yes, I don't know, but maybe I don't need to solve everything. I just need to do my little bit in my little corner, and I'm happy to see that there are lots of other people doing their little bits in their little corners, and that Jana is helping us to connect with each other so that we can support each other. And then the more complex situations become, the more interesting the challenges become. So I have more hope for the future now. Thank you. Merci.